so it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for the morning, Dr. Andrews.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I'm so happy to be here. I'm thankful for the invitation. Chicago is a place that we come often to go to the beach on Lakeshore Drive or visit close friends that I have here. So it is not a city that's unfamiliar to me. Although I have to say, I think this is my first time at UIC. So everyone has been so hospitable, and I'm just thankful for that. I have titled this in the vein of what you're doing this morning and afternoon. I've looked at the program. I looked at it before I came. I'm excited about it. I'm going to sit in on a couple of sessions that I'm curious about. But we're going to talk a little bit about relevance, responsiveness, and sustenance. Because I think we throw this term of cultural relevance around without really nuancing as practitioners what we mean by that, right? And how relevance, responsiveness, and sustenance are important for supporting students' well-being and success. And so I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to give you a lot of frameworks. And so I'm hoping that I see some of you with your little notebook open. I hope you'll jot some things down, because these frameworks are roadmaps for you for the rest of this day, for the sessions you're going into, and then also for your toolkit as you go into the summer and hopefully rest, because rest is resistance, and then also gear up for next year. So let me just start by first saying you did it. I think all of you are at the end of a school year, and in whatever roles you play, you did it, and that's amazing. As Dr. Johnson said, I'm a former teacher, but I also teach these college students, and I did it too. I'm so glad the academic year is over. So congrats to you on that. Give yourself a hand. Secondly, I just want you to know, if no one has, it's not coming up. Okay. Thank you for your awesomeness. It's important that we have social workers, psychologists, clinicians in schools. You are underrepresented. They're not enough in school buildings. And so if no one has told you, you are awesome. I mean that authentically, and thank you for the work you do. And with that goes thanking you really for the lives you touch, right? As someone who is a mother scholar, I have children of my own. I am also an other mother to many young people and big people. I appreciate you, especially in this post-COVID context. And lastly, take a moment to appreciate your own awesomeness. You clapped, but I want you to clap again for yourself, right? We need to affirm ourselves. So I just wanted to start there. I believe in affirmations. We have to start with the positive, because in education, there's so much negative and a lot of negative narratives, and we need to be focused, while acknowledging those, on also being asset-based and strengths-based. Social workers and psychologists and other clinicians are essential. They provide crisis intervention to students, you all do, plans to help with emotion regulation, social emotional learning, to develop intervention strategies. You all work with parents to facilitate the support in children's school adjustment. So what does the literature say? Well, literature says social workers should be applying evidence-based practices, trauma-informed care, social-emotional learning. I want to point out restorative practices is different from restorative justice. Okay, so just note that. Those are two things that are not the same, and there's bodies of work on both of those. And I am sure that many, if not all of you, are utilizing these evidence-based practices in your work. You all are probably familiar with this model, but because I come from an education lens, I wanted to start here as I make connections to relevance, responsiveness, and sustenance. Because even though these are things that the National Association for Social Work indicates that you all do, there are some dispositions that one must have in order to deliver EBPs to address behavioral and mental health concerns, to foster a positive school culture and climate, and to enhance the availability of resources. This is not just textbook work. It is cultural work, it's socio-political work, and there are some dispositions you need to be able to do this work effectively for all children, but particularly for Black and brown children and for other minoritized children, LGBTQIA2S+ students, those who are disabled, religious minorities, etc. And so you know this principle. I'm not going to read it, but I've highlighted a couple things as I think about, in order for you to do this model well, you have got to be attentive to the responsibility to combat negative discrimination. You must be able to recognize and respect ethnic and cultural diversity of societies in which you practice, but it's not just recognition and respect. That's like step one. We gotta go beyond that. And so this morning, I'm gonna challenge you to go beyond that. Cultural awareness is necessary, but it's insufficient. One of the things I want you to be thinking about is what is necessary and sufficient for me to meet the needs in my work for the most vulnerable students I serve. Necessary and sufficient. Critical self-reflection is foundational to that, right? I'm not poo-pooing on awareness. We need that. But the other thing is, you cannot critically self-reflect on your own. So anybody who's like, oh, I'm just journaling and thinking through my positionality by myself. No, ma'am, no, sir, no person. You cannot do that. You must be in dialogue and conversation with others because you can't challenge yourself alone to think deeply and with different perspectives, okay? And so I want you to be thinking about what are the tools, the circles, the critical friend groups that I need to become aware of and challenge my established patterns of thinking and to question my own assumptions. So this is step one. But you cannot critically reflect either without having a sense, of cultural humility. And this is a term, particularly in education, in my discipline, that we're still growing into. People don't use it a lot. I think in your discipline, you talk about cultural competency a lot. But what does it mean? What does it mean to be competent? Competence is not critical consciousness, right? So we need both and. And so if the discourse is primarily talking about competence, I can't master consciousness because culture is dynamic. It's not static. That means young people and their families are constantly changing. The school environments in which they are learning are constantly changing, even if policies and practices and programs are archaic and oppressive and racist and need to change, right? And so we have to have a disposition of cultural humility, which is this attitude that is characterized by our reflection, but it's also the willingness to learn and continually learn. I need you to ask yourself, how do you see or position yourself as a continual learner of culturally responsive social work practice, right? It is lifelong work to be culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining. You got to be in this for the long haul, right? Not even until you retire. It is lifelong work. You don't hang up your cultural relevance hat once you retire professionally, because we should be practicing these things in our personal lives. So let's talk about critical consciousness then. See, when I do this work with school districts and practitioners and folks on college campuses, a lot of times people are not, they want to talk about awareness and diversity, and they don't want to talk about power and privilege. And so for you to be a culturally responsive social worker, you have to be examining issues of power and privilege in school settings and in your relationships with students and families, right? And how they play out in society and your own participation in those systems. We all participate. You know, I'm a race scholar, but I stay in my lane. I'm not a scholar of all kinds of identity markers, so I'm constantly learning, right? I'm constantly thinking about when I might have said something that's heteronormative or ableist or linguist, right? Or cisgendered because of the way I identify. That's critical consciousness. And if you're not doing that work all the time, you've got to step back and say, man, where am I missing the shot in my own professional practice? And again, at micro and macro levels. This is not just about in your relationship with your coworker. Many of us are comfortable working at the individual level. That's not going to change systems for our most vulnerable students. So how are you working to be critically conscious at the interpersonal and micro level and also at the systems level, right? And the ability to recognize inequality and injustice. And then the other part of the consciousness is the acting. So as you enhance your consciousness, I don't have time for guilt. I don't have time for fragility. Now, you're going to feel those things, and then I need you to move past it. Because while you're sitting feeling guilty or fragile, somebody's kid is not getting the services they need. So the action is moving beyond guilt and fragility, okay? Now, I'm going to say some things that might make folks uncomfortable, but it's in our discomfort where we grow. You know, so, I mean, I'm going to go back home, so you can be mad at me, but at the end of the day, when you go back in the fall, I need you to do better. It doesn't mean you haven't done excellent, but we can always improve. And so today is about starting from where we are and improving. Continuous improvement to meet the needs of our most vulnerable students and families. So when you grow your critical consciousness, this is the first framework I'm showing you, right? This is fluid. I need you to be attacking biases, assumptions, stereotypes at the individual, institutional, and structural level. Some of you may be saying, I don't know how to do that at some of those levels. That's why you need critical friends. There are people in the room who do know how to do that. There are people in your building who do know how to do that. So if you're trying to grow your consciousness, get with them and get over whatever the little petty interpersonal stuff is that's blocking you from growing. Right? We have to do that because, again, somebody's baby is at stake. Somebody's baby is at stake when you're not on your P's and Q's because you got an interpersonal thing with somebody that can help you grow. All right, so this requires looking at your lenses. We all have lenses, even me. Let me tell tell you, my challenge is not for the white folks in the room. It's for everybody. Why is it for everybody? Because we are all socialized under the system of white supremacy, and whiteness is a cultural norm. So even folks of color participate when they don't think they're participating. So this is for all of us. We all see the world through lenses that give us a perspective about race, language, ethnicity, class, age, citizenship, ability, sexuality, etc. And those are rooted in our own lived experiences and what we've learned through the institutions in society, school, faith organizations, the media, etc. I need you thinking about how your socialization keeps you stuck in patterns that are harmful and toxic, based on your own identity markers, which inform the way you see the world. When we are working with these children, sometimes I like to use the iceberg analogy. Sometimes we're only looking at the stuff above the water. But it's a whole bunch of stuff that make up these young people's and their families' lived experiences that we're not considering. How do you get to know those aspects of the student better? And I understand some of you have really heavy caseloads, right? No, I know that. And so, what's your strategy for getting to some of this for your most high-risk students in your cases? Because it's too overwhelming to think about all of them and to try to tackle it. And so the big picture becomes, who am I? That's the critical self-reflection. Who are these students I'm serving? How do I get to know them better? But then how do I think about the we? You and those students exist in an ecosystem that's about the school, that's about their families, that's about the community. So it's not one or the other. And it is not linear, meaning you can't be like, I'm gonna go do my self-work and then I'll learn about the students. No, this is all ongoing at the same time. Right? We will come up with all kinds of excuses subconsciously not to push ourselves. So I need you to be thinking about, how do I do the self-work in community with others while I'm also learning about those students and their families, so that my programs, my interventions, my relationships serve them better. So let's look at another framework, and you can jot the names of these down. I hope it's not too blurry, and look them up later. But the multiple worlds typology, I think this is a helpful framework for thinking about your practice. Young people operate in multiple worlds, but you see them in the school world primarily. That world has meanings, perceptions, understandings, thoughts, feelings, strategies. But so does the family world. Oh, that's the self, sorry. Here's the school. Values, beliefs, expectations, and actions, right? But so does the family world. And then their peer group. And then they have their own way of seeing themselves. So now when you think about the effectiveness of your work, you gotta be like, oh my gosh, there are ways in which these worlds collide. There are some similarities across the worlds, but there are some contradictions. And who are you to say that their self-understanding, thoughts, feelings, etc. are like wrong or invalid? That's where we got to check ourselves, right? So I think this multiple worlds typology, even though it's older, I still go back to that for understanding how can my work be most effective when I'm trying to think through and name the multiple worlds that a young person is navigating. And you might be sitting there thinking, oh, there are other worlds too for these young people. And so you, the practitioner, are working through cultural differences. They're just differences. You bring your own norms, values, beliefs, expectations, interaction styles, so do your students, right, in your caseload. But within that is a clash around biases, stereotypes, and assumptions. And let's name the kids have those too. They have a certain way of seeing you. So your work is challenging. They're either going to see you as a support person or somebody who's their adversary. And so how do you cultivate a relationship to not be seen as an adversary, right? Because that's going to make it hard to connect. Sometimes I just name with young people. Look, I got bias. I'm in schools all the time working with high school, black high school students. That's my jam. But I will tell them, I come to this space with biases, stereotypes, and assumptions. I'm like, but you do too. So let's get those out. Like, what's your perception of me? Let's get it out on the table so we can demystify all that. We can deconstruct it, break it down, and start from where we need to start from, right? I want to say, particularly when these kinds of biases, stereotypes, and assumptions are historical, especially if you're a white practitioner working with black and brown students. I mean, we live in the United States. We know the history of racism in this country. And so students come often with those histories in mind. And we shouldn't try to shirk that off like colonialism is real. Displacement of indigenous folks is real. This university is probably built on indigenous ground. Let's just name that and start from that place and say, this is not these people's land, whoever built UIC. Might be some enslaved Africans buried somewhere. They done built a building on top of them. Right, like let's just be real about these things. Anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, anti-Latinxness is real. Anti-Asianness is real. It is historical and it still happens. And young people, Gen Z, is so social justice focused. So if you don't name it, they're gonna name it for you. So don't try to act like it's absent. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
I do like what you said about, just like bringing it out in the open, because when they look at me, they see no white lady.
Sure.
But I have seven grandchildren, 2 of them are Hispanic, and 5 of them are half African American. So, I mean, and I don't say that like, oh, I'm some kind of a saint or something, but I want them to understand that even though I'm not, of that color, I certainly have experiences, my grandchildren have experiences with racism and other kinds of obstacles. So I think, what you're saying, like just lay it out there, I think that's so important.
It is. And I appreciate you sharing your personal experience, because here's another thing. There is one thing to have people of color in your family, but it's different to not share their lived experience. Right? So I appreciate her sharing that. Sometimes saying, I have a biracial grandchild, or my spouse is a person of color. Okay. And what do you want me, the person of color, to do with that? Is that a validation? And so I think what she can do is use that as a entryway for empathy, and yet acknowledge I don't live your everyday experience. It's both and. It is not enough to be like, well, but my sister is a lesbian. Okay, but you're not. And so when you get out of bed every day, your lived experience through the day is not the same, right? So we can't just lift up that we have diverse people in our direct lives, recognize that we can empathize, but we do not share that lived experience, right? So thank you for sharing that. So difference is not the problem. I love this quote by Alan Johnson. I'm not going to read it, but I would ask you all to think about as practitioners. This is a self-reflective moment. How often are you engaging in the things in green? Do you include, elevate, reward, credit, and value young people? And how often do you do the things in purple, right? We just need to think through that. And if you have colleagues who are doing more of the purple, well, we got to work on them because that's toxic. It's harmful. It's violent. I use the term violent. This is violence against these young people when you're doing the things in purple. It's just not physical violence, but it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And at some point, that child is not going to want to come to school, or you keep putting down their guardian about what they're not doing to support their kid. Maybe they don't have the tools or the know-how. And so what are the ways in which you're helping that guardian develop the know-how and navigate the system? So let's look at a couple frameworks. All right. Again, relevance, responsiveness, sustenance. What does it mean to be culturally relevant in your practice, culturally responsive, and culturally sustaining? These are all frameworks from the field of education. And I don't know that they have, other than relevance maybe, I don't know how in-depth responsiveness is in the field of social work. I don't think sustenance is talked about much. So I'm gonna talk about these three. Many of you, some of you may know Gloria Ladson-Billings or her work, right? She is the creator of culturally relevant pedagogy. Pedagogy is one's thoughts about teaching and learning. Like your own, when somebody asks you to write a philosophy statement about teaching and learning, that's your pedagogy, that's your belief. And how does that pedagogy translate into how you practice in schools? So Gloria says, Dr. Ladson-Billings says, and again, this was created for teachers, so I want you all to think about how do I translate and adapt to social work. Students must experience academic success. That's part of relevance. They must. Maybe not in every subject, and how do you define success? Secondly, they must develop and maintain cultural competency in their own culture. So Gloria says they must maintain, watch this, meaning they learned it at home. And you don't try to unlearn what they've been taught at home culturally, how their blackness or Latinxness has been defined at home. That's not your job, right? And then they should develop and maintain cultural competency in another culture. I usually call that the culture of school. We are accountable, I think, to help kids navigate school. My girls know how to navigate. They got a mother who's a professor. They got a mother with 4 degrees, 2 from Harvard. They're gonna be all right. But I'm accountable to help other kids navigate school. How do you do school? Because there's a culture to doing school. And if I got ADD, ODD, somebody got to help me navigate and learn how to do school. Okay? And mama can't do all that. Daddy can't. Y'all are professionals in that. So I need you to operate in your lane and do that. And then lastly, they have to develop socio-political consciousness. A lot of people forget about that third one because they don't want to do that work, because they haven't done that work for themselves. Meaning, as I'm helping these young people navigate school, I am also helping them enhance their critical consciousness about systems of power and privilege that work to advantage them and disadvantage them. They need to be conscious about that, because you're not always going to be there to help them. How do they advocate for themselves? So, this is for those who are more visual. Here's a framework. I can give that to Dr. Johnson to give to you all. But I think that could be helpful in assisting you, okay? I'm watching my time. Get your questions ready. Now, culturally responsive. You may or may not be familiar with Geneva Gay out of University of Washington. So what's the difference between relevance and responsiveness? So Geneva says when we are responsive, we use the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant and effective for them. You are responding by drawing on their assets. But first you gotta see them as having assets. Some of us don't see these kids that are on your caseload as having assets and strengths. That's a deficit disposition that you gotta unlearn to then even draw upon the assets. And so she has 6 characteristics of that. I won't go through all 6, but I want you to see those there. I'll highlight a couple. When you are engaging in your social work, you got high expectations. Leveraging, number 5, leveraging student strengths to transform their educational experience. Okay? So in this way, Dr. Gay is saying that's responsiveness, which is different from relevance. But you can see some overlap in these things. So now let's go, and then of course here's a visual, right, that just kind of pulls our words: cultural connections, high expectations, a critical stance, and thinking about their assets as resources. So then we have culturally sustaining. Well, what did Django Paris and Sammy Alim come to say? Well, they were like, well, relevance and responsiveness are a thing. And they're in my age group, and they were like, we want to respect our elders. We're not saying that what they have coined is insufficient, but we think there's something about being sustaining. And how do we define that? So as you think about your work as a social worker, what does it mean to value the community languages, practices, and ways of being in the world? As you work with these young people, sustaining the culture they already bring, right? And ensure that your school is accountable to the communities. So part of my challenge to you today is you may have been working primarily in your own little circle. You got your caseload, you got your coworkers, etc. Systems won't change if we don't push. And you may be saying, but I can't push by myself. Like, my job could be on the line. I'm not in a position of power. How do you get, right? Critical mass matters. You know there's a policy in place in your building or district that is harmful to your ability to do your work well. We gotta push. We can't just let that policy stay in place. There may be a program that you're like, this is so antiquated. Why are we still doing this? There may be aspects of the student handbook, and you're like, well, as a social worker, I don't know if I can say, yes, you can. Get a couple other friends to go along with you, because if we don't do that, we're not holding these schools and these districts accountable. Okay? So again, some nuances, some similarities. I'm trying to move fast, but that's culturally sustaining. You all aren't directly in the class, but you can talk to teachers about how is your curriculum connecting? Is it all Eurocentric? Is it all, the black and brown kids, they're not interested in that. I'm just telling you, because my kids go to predominantly white schools, and they're like, where's the content about folks of color other than slavery? White kids don't learn about their people in a negative light, because we don't talk about colonialism and white supremacy. But let me move on. Okay. So let me see, how am I doing? Okay, I'm gonna move to questions in a minute. So I want you all to engage in this exercise with me, just with your own little paper. I talked about systems, and I want you all to name the systems for me. I'm recognizing this is US-centric. If it were globally, our categories might look a little different. But in our society, there are systems of privilege, okay? This is getting at that macro level. So I want you to jot on your paper and when I talk about dominant group, I'm not talking about numeric majority. I'm talking about power holding group in the United States. So in our country, by race, who is the dominant group? Don't y'all be scared. Whites, thank you. You write that down. By class, who's the dominant group? Upper class, that's the 1%er thing, right? 1% of the people own 95% of the wealth. By gender, men, cis men. But men nonetheless. Sexuality. Hetero. Straight might be okay in some communities, but I don't say straight. Know your community, I just say heterosexual. I try to ask my LGBTQIA plus friends that's another thing. Don't assume terminology. Ask people from the community.
I feel like gay, it's shifting. More gay persons are, I feel like, gaining power.
Yes, but still not in a majority as heterosexuals.
I think it's Tim Cook.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But that is one, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But when we think about the systems by way of government, schooling, healthcare, those are cis folks who are controlling those institutions. Thank you for raising that. Religion. Christian. Protestant or Catholic? Protestant. Really? Protestant. Catholics are power-wise a religious minority. I don't want to say that. But within Christian, right? Because we don't want to go out of here saying Catholics are religious minorities. Please don't say I said that. But in the Christian faith, Protestants are the hold more power, right? Ability, able-bodied, language, native English speakers. Okay, so then we take that. If I had time and if I had my little worksheet, I'd have you all write down how you position yourself in each of those categories. Because you have to think about your own identity within the systems of privilege and then the ways that relates to the kids and families you serve. How many of those kids and families hold dominant identity markers or subordinate or marginalized identity markers. That in itself moves you to think about maybe the degrees of distance in terms of your relationship building. You following me? Okay. So there may be in here a white upper class cis man who is heterosexual and a Christian, Protestant, or Catholic, able-bodied and native English speaker. He represents, like supreme power in society. And that man needs to think about how he's using those privileges to either advance equity for young people or harm. I'm having you do this because I want you to think about where are you actually enacting systems of oppression in your own personal life, or you're using your privilege to advance equity and justice. Because these are the systems of enactment, and we all participate, y'all, in some way. This is where the critical consciousness comes back in, right? Enhancing that. And so you've got to be thinking about that as you're doing your work. So so the reason I wanted to say that, and you can't see this, is because you work in a system, a big institutional system, that is white normed, and it promotes dominant cultural codes. Our society operates off of the codes of these groups, these identities, and so do schools. So I want you to think about the kids you serve and whether they bring those codes to school or not. And if they don't, again, what are you doing? So I will kind of wrap up here and go to Q&A. Now, if you've seen this, don't be telling everybody. But I stopped using the boys at the baseball fence. I like this better. So as you think about relevance, responsiveness, and sustaining, I think we often don't move our work to be justice focused, okay? And so let's look at this analogy of the tree. You got these two little kids. The tree leans, so you can obviously see that one side is producing more apples because it leans. These kids are both standing on the ground, but this kid is going to get more apples because they fall that way. Okay, that's unequal. Not by this kid's own fault. The tree is leaning. So they have unequal access to the same opportunity to get apples. Now, often in education, we'll be like, we know how to fix that. Let's just give them a ladder with the same number of rungs and the same height. Sameness. Because equality is sameness. Okay, so we do that, but the tree still leans and still produces more apples, and now we just privilege this baby to just get the apples off the tree by using sameness as our outcome. You follow me? So then somebody maybe in your building will be like, that's unjust. We need to think about, this is not equitable. This is equality. Now, equality is not always bad. We need equality. But it doesn't always get us to equal access to opportunities. So then somebody says, well, this kid really needs a taller ladder, right? Let's give this kid the resource they need. We'll customize. But the tree still leans. It still produces more fruit on one side. Now they can pick apples, but they don't have as many to pick. Right? So then I would say, That's not equitable. It's not. It's not just either. That is not working for justice to meet a kid's need. And this kid just over here having a field day, they about to make an apple pie. So then we say, well, justice would be fixing the doggone tree. How many educators and practitioners does it take to figure that out? Right? This is that program, that policy that don't nobody want to touch. We just want to tinker around it. Fix the doggone tree. That's the structural issue. If it stands up straight, now it equally produces. And then they can have the same height ladder. Justice allows equality to be enough. Justice allows equality to be enough. And it achieves equity because fixing the system gives them equal access to tools and opportunities. So you want to talk about being culturally relevant, responsive, or sustaining? Work for justice. It's going to require awareness, consciousness, and action. And that action needs to happen at the individual, institutional, and structural level. So with that, look at all this stuff. I over-prepare all the time. I will leave you, this is my action, right? I can't tell you to do action and not give you action, and then I'll open up for a few questions. I need you to make a commitment. I know you're gonna rest because it's summer, but I do need you to make some goals. What goals can you identify for the next 60 days that help you plan for advancing culturally relevant, responsive, and or? I'm not saying you gotta try to do all three. You might say, I'm just gonna focus on one. But those practices for the next school year. It could be one goal. That's why I put the S in parentheses. But some of you may have multiple ones churning in your head. But nobody, if anybody leaves here without a goal, then I shouldn't have got on the plane. That was in vain. Or you need to get out the profession. Okay? You still got some gas in you. So fill up your tank and rest, and then get ready to go. Get ready to drive for the fall. So I thank you all, and I appreciate you. Dr. Johnson, time for a few quick questions. Anybody got a question? Don't make them hard. Oof. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say thank you for this. It was really, just listening to you explain that, even that last picture, I think was phenomenal. I like the way you deliver it, and it just made me think, looking at the picture, that it's something that happens for the long haul.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Even when you look at the tree,
Yeah.
you see that even though they're getting under equity, they're filling their basket.
Yeah.
It's sparse now.
Yeah.
So they won't be able to do it for the long haul if they're stuck in equity. But when they get to justice and the system is fixed, then they'll be able to fish, right?
Yep.
For more than a day.
Yep. Fixing systems matters. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to talk to Dr. Johnson about some of the framework slides I can give you, because that's public information. Yes. I'll tweak it and send a version to Dr. Johnson to send out. Yes, ma'am.
Balance trauma-informed practices in school with high expectations?
That's a great question. And, I'm not well versed in trauma-informed, but we all, so I think balance is an interesting word, because I don't think you will meet any kid that doesn't want to be pushed, that doesn't want to be challenged. age that doesn't want to be held to a bar as long as someone or someones are supporting them to try to get there. And that even if they don't make this bar, that this is a win getting here, right? The trauma, we can't heal other people's trauma. We can't heal kids' trauma. But I do think that if the bar is here and we do this, we actually add to the trauma. Kids know when we lower our expectations for them, they know it. Any of you who may be caregivers probably can think about it. Your kids know when you have lowered your expectations for them. So I think what we have to do when kids have adverse child experiences is celebrate small wins, small victories. You have to affirm kids who have been traumatized and who have multiple mental health challenges and other kinds of challenges. So there is no balance, but we are navigating trauma and high expectations. I use the word navigating a lot. We're navigating those things. I think we rarely find balance in our work as educators for ourselves or for the students and families we serve. There ain't no balance. It's this, is this, right? So we're navigating. Yes, ma'am.
I enjoyed the presentation as well, that's a good example of the trees also. I wanted to know, in the beginning, you mentioned restorative practice versus restorative justice. I'm not sure I quite got the definition of the two in the presentation.
You didn't. Because I did not put them up there. I'm going to say you all should Google those. So I just had one of my faculty members who is a trauma-informed specialist and a RJ specialist do a professional learning workshop for our faculty on restorative practices. I did not even know that was different from RJ. He had a whole body of literature. So look that up. Right? He was like, as a faculty, we are not restorative. We don't be treating each other right. I was like, come do a professional learning for us. They don't be treating me right. I get microaggressed all the time. As a Black woman leader, so yes, look it up. That is a body of scholarship. It may be small, but restorative practices is a thing. How can we enact restorative practices with one another and with the students we serve? And that's different from RJ, which is restorative justice is a program, and you can do restorative circles, and it's rooted in restorative practices, but it's a thing. Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
Microphone, it's my job, I'm gonna do it.
Yes. We want to be inclusive, yes, for people who need.
This feels a little unnecessary. How do you know, like, especially in a school setting, that high expectations aren't like Eurocentric, white-centered?
That's real good. Well, they are. So we don't need to know because they are. So the question becomes, when are we asking young people, what are your expectations for yourself? Success is also white normed. We have to ask young people, what does success mean to you? Ask their guardians, what would success look like for your baby? And so then you triangulate that. What did the guardians say? What did the kids say? What do I know about doing school effectively? I don't want to impose that definition of success, but I know they need those tools. So how do I incorporate the white normed definition into their own vision for self? And because they're young, so we do want to take into account what parents are saying too, right? You may be the person who has to tell them that. Maybe their mom or dad doesn't know that. That's that navigating. That's that how do you think about options after high school. You have to serve that role for some of these kids. Was there no, I gotta stop. You the last one. Dr. Johnson said I gotta stop. It's you. It's gonna be profound.
So much pressure. Okay. In thinking about your conversation on like pushing and advocating for change within structures and systems, and thinking about the high expectations in a school system, and not coming from the lens of educator, how do you address high expectations with significant skill gaps of some of our students, where behavior kind of plays out within that in the classroom? So the high expectation is they write a 5-paragraph essay for their final, but you've never given them the tools to write that 5-paragraph essay. So then I have to handle the behavior of how that plays out. So
That's a challenge, and that's that piece where you all are working with teachers. Maybe there is a way of assignment modification, but this is relationship building with classroom teachers too. Classroom teachers are stressed out. That kid is in their room all day, every day. Maybe they have pull out with you a couple times a week, and they are trying to manage the whole class, and you're saying, but this kid doesn't have the tools to write. How can we adapt as opposed to just give them a 0 or set them up to fail? So my quickest response is that relational piece with the classroom teacher. How do you cultivate that to think about, we're not cutting corners for a kid, but how do we make modifications so that they have some measure of success for this benchmark? Thank you.